Hello everyone, I am the Boring Historian, and I'm here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from, and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. In the shimmer of an attic summer, as olive trees cast dappled shadows across the dusty ground, an elderly man draws his final breath. His family gathers close, performing the ancient rituals that will ease his passage into the afterlife. They close his eyes and mouth, place a coin under his tongue, and prepare to wash his body with fragrant oils. These actions, practiced for countless generations across the Greek world, reflect a profound understanding of death not as an end, but as a transition. A journey from one state of being to another. To understand the Greek conception of death, we must first understand their view of life. For the ancient Greeks, existence was fundamentally embodied. The living person was an integrated whole of body and psyche, psyche, a term that encompasses what we might call soul, breath, or life force. At death, this unity was severed. The body remained in the world of the living, requiring proper treatment and ritual disposal, while the psyche departed for the shadowy realm of Hades. Unlike many modern conceptions of an afterlife, the Greek underworld was not primarily a place of moral judgment or eternal reward. Instead, it represented a diminished form of existence, a pale echo of life in the sunlit world above. Homer's Odyssey presents us with perhaps the most famous articulation of this view, when the shade of Achilles tells Odysseus, "I would rather be a paid servant in a poor man's house and be above ground than king of kings among the dead." This statement captures the fundamental Greek anxiety about death. Not that it might bring punishment, but that it represented a fading away, a loss of the vitality and substance that made life meaningful. Yet this bleak vision was not universal or static. Greek conceptions of the afterlife evolved substantially over the centuries, influenced by changing social structures, contact with other cultures, and the development of philosophical and religious movements. The earliest archaeological evidence from Mycenaean shaft graves and Tholos tombs suggests belief in some form of continued existence, as evidenced by grave goods including weapons, jewelry, and food offerings. These practices indicate that the deceased were thought to require the same objects in death as in life, suggesting a conception of the afterlife as a mirror of earthly existence. As Greek civilization developed through the archaic and classical periods, afterlife beliefs became more elaborate and systemized. The underworld acquired distinct regions for different categories of the dead, from the punishment fields of Tartarus to the blessed plains of Elysium. The journey to the afterlife grew more complex, involving specific obstacles, guardians, and judgments that the deceased would encounter. These developments reflect broader social changes, the growth of the polis system, increased social stratification, and evolving concepts of justice and moral responsibility. By the late classical and Hellenistic periods, mystery cults like the Eleusinian Mysteries and Orphism introduced revolutionary ideas about the afterlife, including the possibility of blessed immortality for initiates and concepts of reincarnation. These movements represented a significant departure from traditional Homeric views and offered adherents hope for a more positive post-mortem existence. For ordinary Greeks, however, death remained primarily a social and familial concern, rather than an individual spiritual journey. The proper treatment of the dead was essential not just for the deceased's welfare, but for the well-being of the entire community. Unburied or improperly mourned dead could become dangerous, restless spirits. The oroi, those who died untimely deaths, biaithanatoi, those who died violently, and autophoi, the unburied, who might return to trouble the living. Proper funeral rites, Regular offerings at tombs and festival days dedicated to the dead collectively ensured that the boundary between living and dead remained intact. Greek conceptions of death were also deeply gendered. Women played central roles in death rituals, washing and preparing the body, leading lamentations, and maintaining tomb cults. Yet these roles were increasingly regulated and restricted by the male-dominated polis, particularly in Athens. The wild emotional expressions of grief traditionally associated with female mourners were seen as potentially destabilizing to civic order, leading to legislation limiting funeral displays. These tensions reveal the complex interplay between private grief, family honor, and public order that characterize Greek attitudes toward death. The geography of death in Greek thought was equally complex. The underworld was simultaneously a physical location, variously placed at the edges of the known world or deep beneath the earth, and a metaphysical realm beyond normal space and time. Entrances to the underworld were identified at various locations throughout the Greek world. At Cape Tanarum in the southern Peloponnese, at Heraclea Pontica on the Black Sea, in the volcanic regions of central Anatolia, and in the caves of Epirus. These physical gateways to Hades created tangible connections between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, allowing for ritual interactions and occasionally, in myth, actual journeys between the two domains. What emerges from this complex tapestry of beliefs and practices is not a single unified Greek concept of death, but rather a diverse and evolving set of traditions that reflected the tensions and transformations of Greek society itself. Death was simultaneously the great equalizer, claiming kings and slaves alike, and a mirror of social hierarchy, with elaborate tombs and continued fame for the elite and simple burials for commoners. It was both the end of meaningful existence and the beginning of a new phase of being. It was to be feared and resisted, yet accepted as the natural conclusion to the human story. This ambivalence permeates Greek literature, art, and philosophy. The same culture that celebrated heroic deaths and promised paradisiacal afterlives for the worthy also produced Epicurus's famous argument that death is nothing to us, since when we exist, death is not present, and when death is present, we do not exist. Greek conceptions of death were never settled or singular, but rather remained a site of continuous cultural negotiation and personal reflection. A mirror in which the Greeks saw both their deepest fears and their highest aspirations reflected back at them. The origins of Greek afterlife beliefs stretch back into the misty prehistoric past, emerging from the complex interplay of indigenous developments and external influences. Archaeological evidence provides our earliest window into these nascent conceptions, though interpreting material remains as indicators of spiritual beliefs requires caution and nuance. The Neolithic settlements of Greece, 7000 to 3000 BCE, already show signs of ritual treatment of the dead. At sites like Knossos on Crete and Dimini in Thessaly, human remains were carefully deposited in collective tombs, sometimes accompanied by figurines, pottery, and tools. These practices suggest early beliefs in some form of continued existence after death, requiring provisions for the deceased's journey or new life. However, the nature of this afterlife, whether conceived as a separate realm or as continued presence among the living, remains obscure. The Bronze Age civilizations of Greece, roughly 3000 to 1100 BCE, provide more substantial evidence. The Minoan civilization of Crete developed elaborate communal tombs, circular tholotombs and house tombs, where bodies were deposited over generations, suggesting a concept of collective ancestral existence. Grave goods including jewelry, weapons, seals, and pottery vessels for food and drink imply preparation for the deceased's needs in another world. Particularly telling are Minoan funerary symbols like the double axe, labrys, butterfly, and chrysalis, which suggest concepts of transformation after death, rather than simple extinction. On mainland Greece, the Mycenaean civilization 1600 to 1100 BCE developed even more elaborate funerary practices. Their shaft graves and monumental tholos tombs contained spectacular wealth: gold death masks, bronze weapons, ivory goods, and amber jewelry, indicating belief in a high-status afterlife requiring the trappings of earthly power. The famous Mask of Agamemnon, discovered by Heinrich Schliemann at Mycenae, reveals the importance of preserving the identity of the deceased, suggesting that individuality persisted beyond death. Linear B tablets from this period mention offerings to deities and possibly ancestral spirits, though their fragmentary nature limits our understanding of Mycenaean religious beliefs. Some scholars have identified possible early references to underworld deities, including a precursor to Persephone under the name Preswa, and perhaps Poseidon in his chthonic aspect as Poseidao. However, nothing approaching a systematic underworld cosmology appears in the surviving records. The collapse of Mycenaean civilization around 1100 BCE ushered in the Greek Dark Age, 1100 to 800 BCE, a period of reduced literacy and material culture. Yet even in this era of apparent regression, funerary practices suggest continuing belief in an afterlife. The shift from burial to cremation that characterizes this period might indicate changing conceptions of the soul's journey, the flames perhaps serving to release the spirit from its bodily prison. But continuity in offerings and grave markers suggests persistent belief in the needs of the dead. As Greece emerged from the Dark Age into the Archaic period, 800 to 480 BCE, our evidence for afterlife beliefs increases dramatically. Homer's epics, composed around the 8th century BCE, though drawing on older oral traditions, provide our first detailed literary descriptions of the Greek underworld. In Book 11 of the Odyssey, the famous Nekia episode, Odysseus journeys to the borders of the underworld to consult the shade of the prophet Tiresias. There he encounters numerous deceased figures from Greek mythology, revealing a conception of death as a shadowy, diminished existence. The dead are described as strengthless heads of the perished, lacking the vigor and substance of the living. They can speak and remember their mortal lives, but only after drinking sacrificial blood, which temporarily restores some semblance of vitality. Homer's underworld is relatively undifferentiated, a universal destination for all mortals, regardless of their conduct in life, with only a few exceptional figures receiving special punishment or reward. Notably absent is any systematic judgment of the dead or moral determination of their fate. This corresponds with the aristocratic warrior ethos of Homeric society, where glory, kleos, achieved in life through heroic deeds, served as the only real immortality. The 7th and 6th centuries BCE saw the introduction and spread of mystery cults that offered alternative visions of the afterlife. The Eleusinian mysteries centered on the goddess Demeter and her daughter Persephone, the reluctant queen of the underworld, promised initiates a blessed existence after death. Though the exact nature of these promises remains obscure due to the secrecy surrounding the mysteries, they clearly represented a significant departure from the bleak Homeric afterlife. As the poet Pindar would later write of the Eleusinian initiates, "Blessed is he who has seen these things before he goes beneath the hollow earth, for he understands the end of mortal life and the beginning of a new life given by the gods." Even more revolutionary was the emergence of Orphism in the 6th century BCE, a religious movement attributed to the mythical poet Orpheus. Orphic beliefs included the concept of metempsychosis, reincarnation, the soul cycling through multiple lives in different bodies, and the possibility of eventually escaping this cycle through ritual purification and correct living. This conception reflected Eastern influences, particularly from Egypt and possibly India, filtered through Greek cultural sensibilities. The discovery of gold tablets in graves of presumed Orphic initiates from the 4th century BCE onward has provided direct evidence of these beliefs, with inscriptions providing the deceased with instructions for navigating the underworld and declarations to make before the underworld judges. These mystery traditions did not replace the traditional Greek views, but existed alongside them, creating a complex religious landscape where multiple conceptions of the afterlife coexisted and sometimes interpenetrated. The traditional practices of ancestor worship and tomb cult continued throughout Greek history, with families maintaining relationships with their dead through regular offerings and commemorative rituals. The archaeological record reveals this complexity. Greek cemeteries from the Archaic period onward show diverse burial practices, inhumation and cremation occurring simultaneously, sometimes within the same family plot. Grave goods range from minimal to elaborate, with certain items like oil flasks, lekythoi, coins, and food vessels appearing consistently, suggesting widely shared beliefs about the journey to and existence in the underworld. Tomb inscriptions reveal attitudes ranging from hope for a blessed afterlife to bitter resignation about death's finality. What emerges from this evidence is not a linear evolution from primitive to sophisticated afterlife beliefs, but rather a continuous process of cultural negotiation and synthesis. Indigenous Greek traditions merged with imported concepts. Elite philosophical speculations existed alongside popular beliefs, and older practices persisted even as new ideas gained acceptance. The resulting tapestry of beliefs provided Greeks with multiple frameworks for understanding death and its aftermath, allowing individuals and communities to draw upon different traditions according to their needs and circumstances. By the classical period, 480 to 323 BCE, this complex heritage had crystallized into a recognizable but still diverse set of beliefs about the afterlife. The underworld had acquired its familiar geography of rivers and regions, its population of judges and guardians, and its system of rewards and punishments. Yet significant questions remained open to interpretation and debate. Was virtue in life rewarded after death? Could the living influence the fate of the dead through rituals and offerings? Was reincarnation possible? Did the personality survive death intact, or did individual consciousness dissolve into a collective ancestral existence? These questions would continue to engage Greek thinkers throughout antiquity, with each generation reinterpreting inherited traditions in light of new philosophical insights and changing social realities. The early origins of Greek afterlife beliefs thus established not just a set of specific concepts about death and what follows, but more importantly, a framework for ongoing inquiry into one of humanity's most persistent mysteries. The Greek conception of the underworld underwent substantial evolution over the centuries, transforming from a vague, shadowy realm in the earliest sources to an elaborate cosmological system with distinct regions, inhabitants, and governing principles. This evolution reflects broader changes in Greek society, religious thought, and moral philosophy, revealing how afterlife beliefs responded to and helped shape cultural developments. In the Homeric epics, our earliest literary sources, the underworld, variously called Hades, after its ruler, Erebus, darkness, or simply the House of Death, appears as a dim, murky realm located either at the far western edge of the world or deep beneath the earth. It is separated from the land of the living by several bodies of water, most notably the river Styx, though Homer also mentions the rivers Acheron, Pyriphlegethon, and Cocytus. Access requires crossing these waters, typically with the aid of the ferryman Charon, though he is not mentioned by name in Homer. This early underworld is notably non-judgmental. With few exceptions, all dead share the same fate regardless of their conduct in life. The shades of the dead exist in a diminished, dreamlike state, retaining their memories and personalities but lacking physical substance or vitality. They drift aimlessly through the gloom, a fate Homer presents as pitiable rather than punitive. Only a handful of extraordinary transgressors face eternal punishment. Tydeus, whose liver is eternally devoured by vultures for attempting to rape Leto. Tantalus, who suffers unquenchable thirst and hunger for serving his son as a meal to the gods. And Sisyphus, condemned to endlessly roll a boulder uphill for his craftiness and deceit. Similarly, special rewards are exceedingly rare. Menelaus, in the Odyssey, is promised transport to the Elysian fields, not because of moral virtue, but due to his status as Zeus's son-in-law. This paradise is described as a place where life is easiest for men. No snow is there, nor heavy storm, nor ever rain, but ever does ocean send up blasts of the clear-blowing west wind that they may give cooling to men. This exceptional destination, however, is not presented as a general possibility for ordinary mortals. As Greek society evolved through the Archaic period, 800 to 480 BCE, so too did underworld mythology. The introduction and spread of mystery religions, particularly the Eleusinian mysteries and Orphism, introduced revolutionary concepts: the possibility of a blessed afterlife for initiates, judgment of the dead based on moral conduct and ritual purity, and in the case of Orphism, the cycle of reincarnation. These developments reflected changing societal values, particularly the growing importance of individual responsibility and ethical behavior over aristocratic status. By the 5th century BCE, we find a more differentiated underworld emerging in sources like Pindar's Odes and Aristophanes' comedies. In Pindar's Second Olympian Ode, composed around 476 BCE, he describes a threefold division of the afterlife. Ordinary souls are judged and assigned to appropriate rewards or punishments. Those who have lived virtuously through 3 lives may journey to the Isle of the Blessed, a developed form of Elysium, while the wicked suffer punishment proportional to their crimes. This conception reflects not only religious developments, but also the growing importance of legal systems and concepts of proportional justice in Greek city-states. Plato, writing in the 4th century BCE, further developed these ideas in dialogues like the Phaedo, Gorgias, and Republic. In the Gorgias, Socrates presents a detailed myth of judgment in which souls, stripped of bodily appearance and social status, are evaluated purely on their moral character. The judges, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus, assign the virtuous to the islands of the blessed and the wicked to Tartarus for punishment. Some can be rehabilitated through punishment, while the most extreme offenders suffer eternally as examples to others. This conception reflects Plato's philosophical concerns with justice, the cultivation of virtue, and the soul's immortality. In the Republic's concluding myth of air, Plato presents his most elaborate vision of the afterlife, incorporating the concept of reincarnation. Souls gather in a meadow after death to be judged, then journey either above to the heavens or below to the underworld for rewards or punishments lasting 1,000 years. They then gather at the spindle of necessity, where they choose their next lives, a choice determined by the wisdom they have acquired. This complex eschatology reflects Plato's concern with moral choice, philosophical education, and cosmic order. Parallel to these philosophical developments, popular conceptions of the underworld were elaborated in poetry, drama, and visual art. By the Hellenistic period 323 to 31 BCE, a standardized geography of the underworld had emerged, featuring 5 rivers with symbolic significance: Styx, hatred; Acheron, sorrow; Cocytus, lamentation; Phlegethon, fire; and Lethe, forgetfulness. The realm was divided into distinct regions: Tartarus for the punished, the Asphodel meadows for ordinary souls, Elysium for the blessed, and sometimes the Isles of the Blessed for heroes and those specially favored by the gods. The population of the underworld expanded to include various guardians and administrators: Charon the ferryman, Cerberus the three-headed hound guarding the entrance, the judges Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus, the Erinyes, Furies who pursued oathbreakers and kinslayers, and a host of personified abstractions, including sleep, death, strife, and old age. This bureaucratization of the afterlife paralleled developments in Hellenistic political systems, with their complex administrative hierarchies. Visual representations of the underworld became more elaborate during this period. Vase paintings, tomb frescoes, and funerary reliefs depicted scenes of judgment, punishment, and blessed existence. The 4th century BCE tomb of the diver at Paestum shows a symposium scene possibly representing the blessed afterlife, while vases depict Orpheus, Heracles, and other heroes during their mythic visits to the underworld. These visual programs both reflected and shaped popular conceptions of what awaited beyond death. Roman-era Greek writers like Plutarch, Lucian, and Pausanias preserved and further developed underworld mythology. Plutarch's essay on the delay of divine vengeance presents an elaborate vision of post-mortem judgment and punishment, while his On the Face in the Moon's Orb locates different stages of the soul's journey in cosmic space. Lucian's satirical Dialogues of the Dead uses underworld settings to mock human vanity and pretension. These works show how underworld mythology remained a fertile ground for exploring philosophical, moral, and social questions, even as traditional Greek religion faced challenges from Christianity and other new religious movements. Throughout this evolution, certain tensions remained unresolved. Was the underworld primarily a place of compensation, where earthly injustices were rectified through rewards and punishments? Or was it simply the natural continuation of existence in another form? Was it governed by divine moral law, or by amoral cosmic necessity? Was individual identity preserved intact, or did personality dissolve into a more generalized ancestral existence? Different traditions answered these questions differently, and individual Greeks likely held various, sometimes contradictory beliefs simultaneously, much as people today might combine elements from various religious and philosophical traditions in their personal understanding of death and what follows. What remained constant was the understanding that death represented not annihilation but transition, and that proper ritual observance was essential for ensuring that this transition proceeded smoothly. The evolution of underworld mythology thus reflects the Greek cultural genius for synthesis and adaptation. Indigenous traditions merged with imported concepts. Elite philosophical speculation was influenced by popular belief. Older conceptions persisted alongside newer developments. The result was not a fixed dogma, but a flexible framework that could accommodate diverse perspectives, while providing shared cultural references that united Greeks across political, social, and geographical boundaries. While literary sources often present a seemingly unified vision of the Greek afterlife, archaeological evidence and local traditions reveal significant regional variations in beliefs and practices across the Hellenic world. From the mainland to the islands, from Asia Minor to Magna Graecia, Greek communities developed distinctive approaches to death, burial, and the afterlife that reflected their particular historical experiences, environmental conditions, and cultural contexts. In Athens and Attica, the evolution of funerary practices closely tracked political developments. The lavish aristocratic burials of the archaic period gave way to more restrained customs as democratic ideals took hold, with legislation like that of Solon explicitly limiting funeral expenditure and display. Athenian grave markers, stelae, from the classical period typically depict peaceful scenes of departure rather than the underworld itself, emphasizing family relationships and civic identity over explicit afterlife imagery. The famous white ground lekythoi oil flasks, placed in Athenian tombs, often show visits to the grave or mythological scenes related to death, but rarely depict the afterlife directly. This restraint reflects Athenian democratic values, which emphasized the collective over the individual and viewed excessive concern with personal immortality as potentially subversive to civic solidarity. In stark contrast, the Greek colonies of southern Italy and Sicily, Magna Graecia, developed much more elaborate and explicit afterlife iconography. The magnificent painted tombs of Paestum, ancient Poseidonia, from the 4th century BCE, show vivid scenes of the afterlife, including funeral games, processions, and banquets in the underworld. Similarly, Apulian red figure vases from this region frequently depict elaborate underworld scenes, with Hades and Persephone enthroned, surrounded by mythological figures and blessed souls enjoying eternal symposia. This regional tradition likely reflects the strong influence of indigenous Italic peoples, particularly the Etruscans, whose tomb paintings reveal a vivid conception of the afterlife. It may also reflect the particular popularity of mystery cults, especially Orphism and Dionysiac mysteries, in these regions. The island of Crete maintained distinctive funerary traditions that reflected its unique historical legacy as the center of Minoan civilization. Even in the classical and Hellenistic periods, long after Minoan culture had disappeared, Cretan burial practices continued to show distinctive features, including the use of clay coffins, larnax, decorated with symbols of regeneration like double axes and butterflies. Cretan funerary inscriptions sometimes reference local underworld deities and heroes, not prominent in mainstream Greek tradition. The worship of Zeus Volcanos, a chthonic aspect of Zeus associated with vegetation cycles and rebirth, persisted on Crete as a distinctive regional cult with implications for afterlife beliefs. Rhodes and other eastern Aegean islands developed funerary traditions influenced by their position at the crossroads of Greek and Near Eastern cultures. Rhodian tomb architecture shows Persian and Egyptian influences, while funerary inscriptions reveal complex beliefs combining Greek concepts with Eastern elements. Some Rhodian epitaphs, for instance, address Persephone with epithets linking her to Near Eastern goddesses like Cybele and Isis, creating syncretistic afterlife beliefs that transcended strict cultural boundaries. In Macedonia, royal burials reveal a distinctive northern Greek conception of the afterlife, focused on heroization of the dead. The spectacular royal tombs at Vergina, possibly including that of Philip II, father of Alexander the Great, contained elaborate gold wreaths, silver funerary couches, and weapons that suggest belief in a militarized, aristocratic afterlife where the deceased continued to enjoy royal status. The hunting friezes decorating these tombs may represent the blessed activities awaiting the heroized dead. This Macedonian tradition, emphasizing personal immortality and heroic status, stands in marked contrast to the more communal, civic-focused Athenian approach. Thessaly, with its distinctive aristocratic social structure, dominated by wealthy landowning families, maintained funerary traditions emphasizing ancestral continuity. Thessalian tomb markers often featured cavalry scenes, reflecting the region's famous horsemen, suggesting that elite identity continued into the afterlife. Archaeological evidence indicates Thessalian preference for inhumation over cremation, possibly reflecting regional beliefs about bodily integrity in the afterlife. The Thessalian city of Pherae was associated with Hecate, goddess of crossroads and transitions between worlds, whose cult influenced regional conceptions of the journey to the underworld. The Greek colonies along the Black Sea coast developed afterlife beliefs influenced by contact with Scythian and other non-Greek peoples of the region. Tombs from cities like Olbia and Pantocapaeum reveal syncretic practices combining Greek elements with local traditions. Golden funeral masks, similar to the Mycenaean examples, but dating to the Hellenistic period, suggest persistent belief in the need to preserve identity after death. Orphic gold tablets found in these regions contain distinctive variations of the standard texts, indicating regional adaptations of these mystic teachings. Even within mainland Greece, significant local variations existed. Sparta's austere approach to death, with simple burial practices and prohibitions against naming the deceased on grave markers except for those who died in battle or childbirth, reflected its militaristic ethos and emphasis on the collective over the individual. The Spartan practice of burying kings within the city, contrary to the normal Greek custom of extramural burial, created a direct physical link between the ruling lineage and the community, suggesting a concept of ancestral presence distinct from mainstream Greek views. In Arcadia, an isolated and conservative region of the central Peloponnese, ancient traditions persisted long after they had been abandoned elsewhere. Arcadian myths preserved distinctive underworld geography, including the belief that the entrance to Hades was located at Lake Stymphalia. The region maintained ancient cults of chthonic deities like Demeter Melina, Black Demeter, whose worship involved unique rituals related to death and rebirth. Arcadian funerary customs, including the use of stone-lined cist graves, long after other regions had adopted different practices, reflect this cultural conservatism. Underlying these regional variations were differences in how various Greek communities conceptualized the relationship between the living and the dead. In some regions, especially those influenced by mystery religions, the boundary between life and death was seen as permeable, with possibilities for communication and even movement between realms. In others, a stricter separation was maintained, with elaborate rituals ensuring that the dead remained properly confined to their own sphere. Environmental factors also played a role in shaping regional beliefs. In volcanic areas like parts of Sicily and Asia Minor, active geological features such as fumaroles, hot springs, and cave systems that emitted noxious gases were often identified as entrances to the underworld, or places where the boundary between worlds was thin. These natural features provided tangible, physical manifestations of underworld geography that influenced local conceptions of the afterlife journey. Political relationships between communities affected the spread and adaptation of afterlife beliefs. Athens' imperial ambitions during the 5th century BCE, for instance, led to the increased prominence of Eleusinian mystery cult ideas throughout the Aegean, as the city promoted the cult as part of its cultural program. Later, Alexander the Great's conquests facilitated the spread of Greek afterlife concepts to Egypt and the Near East, while simultaneously exposing Greeks to Eastern traditions that influenced their own beliefs. What emerges from this regional survey is not a single Greek afterlife, but rather a complex mosaic of interconnected yet distinctive traditions. Local communities adapted core Greek concepts to their particular circumstances, creating variations that reflected their specific historical experiences, social structures, and cultural contexts. This diversity reminds us that Greek religion was not a unified, dogmatic system, but a living, evolving set of practices that responded to local needs and conditions, while maintaining enough shared elements to create a recognizable cultural koine, common tradition, across the Hellenic world. In Greek cosmology, the underworld was not merely a vague realm of shadows, but a complex landscape with distinct topographical features. Among the most significant elements of this infernal geography were the 5 rivers that wound through Hades, each embodying different aspects of the death experience and serving specific functions in the afterlife journey. These waterways, the Styx, Acheron, Cocytus, Phlegethon, and Lethe, were more than mere physical barriers. They were powerful symbolic boundaries, demarcating the territories of life and death, memory and oblivion, suffering and release. The most famous of these infernal waterways was the Styx, whose name derives from the Greek verb stigeo, meaning to hate or to abhor. As the primary boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, the Styx represented the absolute division created by death, the unbridgeable chasm that separated mortal existence from what lay beyond. According to Hesiod's Theogony, the Styx was the daughter of Oceanus and Tethys, making her one of the oldest deities in the Greek pantheon. This divine status elevated the river beyond a mere geographical feature. The Styx was herself a goddess, one so powerful that oaths sworn in her name were binding even upon the Olympian gods themselves. In Homer's Iliad, the goddess Styx is described as the dread river of oath, by which the gods swear their most solemn vows. To break such an oath brought terrible punishment. The perjuring god would lie breathless for a year, unable to partake of nectar and ambrosia, followed by 9 years of exile from divine councils and feasts. This association with inviolable oaths reflects the river's connection to the irrevocable nature of death. Like a divine promise, death once enacted could not be undone or reversed. The physical description of the Styx varies across ancient sources. Homer portrays it as one of several rivers flowing into the central waterway of Acheron. Later traditions, however, elevated the Styx to preeminence among the underworld rivers. Virgil, in the Aeneid, describes it as encircling the underworld 9 times, creating an impenetrable barrier that souls cannot cross without the aid of Charon, the ferryman. This image of the 9-fold Styx underscores its role as the ultimate boundary, one that completely encloses and contains the realm of the dead. Various locations in the Greek world were identified as entrances to the Styx, or places where its waters emerged into the upper world. The most famous was at Nonacris in Arcadia, where a waterfall cascading down a precipitous mountain face was said to be the Styx itself. This water was reputed to be deadly poisonous, so corrosive that it would dissolve any vessel except one made from a horse's hoof. According to legend, this water was used to poison Alexander the Great. The lethal nature of these terrestrial manifestations of the Styx reinforced the river's association with death and the absolute separation it enforced between the realms of the living and the dead. The second major river of the underworld was the Acheron, whose name suggests river of woe, from achos, distress or pain. In early sources like Homer's Odyssey, the Acheron appears as the central waterway of the underworld, with other rivers flowing into it. Odysseus performs his necromantic ritual at the point where the Phlegethon and Cocytus flow into the Acheron, suggesting that this confluence marks a particularly potent boundary between worlds. The geographical reality behind the mythic Acheron may be found in Epirus, northwestern Greece, where a real river of this name flows into the Ionian Sea near the ancient city of Ephyra, later called Sycurus. This region was associated with an oracle of the dead, Nekiomanteon, where visitors could supposedly communicate with deceased loved ones. The river passes through a narrow gorge before disappearing underground briefly and then emerging to flow through marshy lowlands to the sea. Physical features that may have suggested connections to the underworld. The Greek geographer Pausanias noted that the water of the Epirote Acheron was unpleasant to taste, reinforcing its associations with bitterness and sorrow. In later traditions, particularly those influenced by mystery religions, the Acheron became increasingly central to underworld topography. Plato, in the Phaedo, describes souls being led to the Acheron after judgment, where they board vessels for their assigned destinations in the afterlife. Virgil follows this tradition in the Aeneid, describing the shores of Acheron as crowded with the shades of the dead awaiting passage. The centrality of the Acheron in these accounts reflects its role as not merely a boundary, but a transitional space, the river that must be navigated as part of the soul's journey to its final destination. The third underworld river, the Cocytus, derives its name from the Greek kokitos, meaning lamentation or wailing. As this etymology suggests, the Cocytus embodied the grief and mourning associated with death. In Homer's underworld geography, the Cocytus is described as a branch of the Styx flowing into the Acheron at the world's edge. Later traditions elaborated on this relationship, with the Cocytus often portrayed as a dark and mournful marsh or lagoon rather than a flowing river. Like the Acheron, the mythic Cocytus had a real-world counterpart, a tributary of the Acheron River in Epirus. This physical Cocytus flows through a particularly desolate and echoing gorge, where the sounds of rushing water might be imagined as wails of grief. The association of this river with lamentation reflected Greek funerary practices, in which ritualized expressions of grief played a central role. The Cocytus thus represented the emotional dimension of death, the pain of separation and loss experienced by both the deceased, mourning their own mortality, and those left behind. The fourth river, the Phlegethon, or Pyrophlegethon, presents a striking contrast to the dark, cold waters of the other underworld rivers. Its name derives from phleggo, to burn, and ancient sources describe it as a river of fire rather than water. According to Homer, the Pyrophlegethon flows alongside the Cocytus into the Acheron. Later traditions, particularly those influenced by Orphic and Pythagorean teachings, associated the Phlegethon specifically with punishment, describing it as surrounding or flowing through Tartarus, the region where the wicked suffered torment. Plato in the Phaedo provides the most detailed description of the Phlegethon, portraying it as a river of molten lava that occasionally erupts to the Earth's surface through volcanoes. This connection to volcanic activity suggests that observations of natural phenomena influence the development of underworld geography. The active volcanic regions of southern Italy and Sicily, where Greek colonists settled, provided visual models for imagining rivers of fire in the underworld. The dual nature of fire, both destructive and purifying, gave the Phlegethon a complex symbolic role. In some traditions, particularly those influenced by mystery religions, passage through or immersion in its flames could purge the soul of impurities, preparing it for a blessed afterlife. The fifth and final major river was the Lethe, whose name means forgetfulness or oblivion, from Lethe, Lethe. Unlike the other rivers, which appear in early sources like Homer, the Lethe emerged as a significant feature of underworld geography, primarily in later traditions, particularly those influenced by Orphic and Pythagorean beliefs. The concept of a river that erased memories aligned with evolving Greek ideas about reincarnation and the soul's journey across multiple lifetimes. In contrast to the other underworld rivers, which represented aspects of the death experience itself, The Lethe was associated with the possibility of rebirth. According to Plato's myth of Ur in the Republic, souls preparing for reincarnation would drink from the Lethe, causing them to forget their previous existence before entering new bodies. The amount consumed determined how much of their past lives would be forgotten. Those pursuing philosophical wisdom during life might drink less and retain some memory of eternal truths, explaining the phenomenon of anamnesis, recollection, that Plato elsewhere describes as the source of true knowledge. Virgil elaborates on this tradition in Book 6 of the Aeneid, describing a countless multitude of souls gathered by the waters of Lethe, who in long array were drinking the waters of the stream, those waters which free men from care and bring deep forgetfulness. These souls, having completed their period of purification or punishment, prepare to return to earthly life by shedding the burden of memory. The Lethe thus functioned as both an ending and a beginning, closing the book on one existence while preparing the soul for the next chapter in its journey. The placement of Lethe varied in different traditions. Some located it in Erebus, the darkest region of Hades. Others placed it near the Elysian Fields or the white cypress grove of Persephone. In Orphic traditions, initiates were instructed to avoid the Lethe and instead drink from the contrasting pool of Mnemosyne, memory, thereby breaking the cycle of reincarnation and achieving true immortality. This instruction appears on gold tablets found in graves of presumed Orphic initiates, which contain directions like, "You will find to the left of the house of Hades a spring, and standing by it a white cypress. Do not even approach this spring. You will find another, from the lake of memory, cold water flowing forth, but there are guardians before it." Beyond these 5 principal rivers, Greek tradition occasionally mentioned other waterways. The Eridanus, primarily known as a mythic river of the upper world, often identified with the Po in northern Italy, was sometimes described as flowing through the underworld as well. The Oceanus, the great world-encircling river, was occasionally portrayed as bordering or connecting to the underworld, reflecting the Greek conception of Hades as located at the literal ends of the earth. Various springs and lakes also featured in underworld topography, including the aforementioned Lake of Memory, associated with Orphic traditions. The development of this elaborate river system reflects the Greek understanding of water as a boundary substance, neither fully of the earth nor fully separate from it, simultaneously barrier and medium of passage. In Greek funerary practices, water played essential purificatory roles. The body was washed before burial, libations were poured at tombs, and clay vessels containing water were often included among grave goods. The prominence of rivers in underworld geography extended these ritual associations into the mythic realm, creating a coherent symbolic language that connected everyday funeral practices with cosmic geography. The 5 rivers also embodied the complex Greek attitudes toward death itself. The Styx represented death's inevitability and finality, the Acheron its sorrowful aspect, the Cocytus the grief it caused, the Phlegethon its potentially purifying or punishing dimensions, and the Lethe the possibility of release and renewal. Together, they created a nuanced symbolic system for understanding mortality's multiple facets. Navigating these rivers required supernatural assistance, most famously from Charon, the aged ferryman who transported souls across the Acheron, or sometimes the Styx, in his narrow skiff. Payment for this service came in the form of an obolos, coin, traditionally placed in the mouth of the deceased during funeral preparations. Archaeological evidence confirms this practice. Coins have been found in the mouths or hands of skeletons in ancient Greek burials across the Mediterranean world. For those without proper burial or payment, Tradition held that they would be stranded on the near shore for 100 years before being permitted to cross. This economic transaction at the threshold of the afterlife reveals how thoroughly the Greeks imagined the underworld as a reflection of their own social systems. Even in death, passage required payment, and proper observance of societal norms determined one's fate. The rivers of Hades thus served not merely as mythical geography, but as expressions of fundamental Greek concerns about social order, ritual obligation, and the relationship between the individual and the community, concerns that extended beyond death into the eternal realm of Hades. The Greek conceptualization of the afterlife evolved from the relatively undifferentiated shadowy realm depicted in Homer to an increasingly complex system of distinct regions, each serving specific cosmic and moral functions. This evolution reflected broader developments in Greek thinking about justice, moral responsibility, and the relationship between human conduct and divine order. By the classical period, the underworld had developed clearly defined territories that accommodated different categories of the dead, creating a geography that mirrored and extended the moral landscapes of the living world. The most notorious region of the Greek underworld was Tartarus, a place of darkness, suffering, and punishment. In the earliest Greek cosmogony, Hesiod's Theogony, Tartarus appears as one of the primordial entities that existed at the beginning of creation, a murky abyss located as far beneath the earth as heaven is above it. Hesiod describes it as surrounded by a bronze fence with gates crafted by Poseidon, emphasizing its nature as a secure prison from which there is no escape. This primeval Tartarus served primarily as the place of confinement for the defeated enemies of the Olympian gods, the Titans, who had fought against Zeus in the Titanomachy, and monsters like Typhon, who had threatened divine order. As Greek moral thinking developed, this cosmological prison gradually transformed into a place of punishment for human transgressors as well as divine ones. By the classical period, Tartarus had become specifically associated with exemplary sinners whose offenses were deemed worthy of eternal punishment. The paradigmatic inhabitants of this realm were figures from mythology whose stories served as moral cautionary tales. Sisyphus, condemned to roll a boulder up a hill only to have it roll back down again. Tantalus, eternally thirsty and hungry while standing in a pool of water beneath fruit-laden branches that receded from his grasp. Ixion, bound to a perpetually turning wheel of fire. And Tydeus, whose liver was eternally devoured by vultures only to regenerate each night. What united these mythic criminals was not merely the severity of their punishments, but the nature of their transgressions. Each had committed what the Greeks considered hybris, extreme arrogance that led them to violate fundamental boundaries between mortals and gods, or to transgress basic principles of civilized behavior. Sisyphus had cheated death itself. Tantalus had attempted to deceive the gods by serving them his own son at a banquet. Ixion had attempted to seduce Hera and then boasted of it. Tydeus had attempted to rape Leto, mother of Apollo and Artemis. These were not merely crimes but assaults on the cosmic order itself, warranting exceptional and eternal punishment. The specificity of these punishments revealed another important aspect of Tartarus, the principle of lex talionis, or punishment fitting the crime. Each torment ingeniously reflected the nature of the original transgression. Tantalus, who had abused sacred guest-host relationships through cannibalism, suffered eternal hunger and thirst, a perpetual denial of proper hospitality. Sisyphus, who had used his cleverness to cheat death, was condemned to endless futile labor that mocked his vaunted intelligence. This principle would later be elaborated in philosophical and mystery traditions to encompass ordinary human sinners, as well as mythic exemplars. Plato provides our most detailed philosophical exploration of this expanded conception of Tartarus in the Gorgias, where Socrates describes a system of underworld judgment and punishment. According to this account, the naked souls of the dead are judged solely on the state of their character, without regard to their earthly status. Those found to have lived justly proceed to the Isles of the Blessed, while those who have lived unjustly are sent to Tartarus. However, an important distinction is made. Those whose transgressions are curable undergo punishment that causes them to benefit, before eventually being released, while those deemed incurable suffer eternal torment not for their own benefit, since they are beyond redemption, but as examples to others. This conception of Tartarus reflects the evolution of Greek penological thinking, which increasingly distinguished between retributive punishment, timoria, and corrective punishment, kolossus. The torments of Tartarus could serve either purpose: rehabilitation for ordinary sinners, or eternal retribution for the most extreme transgressors. This distinction appears even more clearly in Plato's Phaedo, where he describes various categories of wrongdoers receiving appropriate treatments in the afterlife, with only the most heinous offenders, those guilty of numerous and enormous sacrileges or many unjust and illegal murders, suffering permanent confinement in Tartarus. Visual representations of Tartarus became increasingly elaborate in Greek art of the classical and Hellenistic periods. Vase paintings depict the famous mythic sinners in their torments, often supervised by chthonic deities or personifications of justice. The Apulian Volute crater by the underworld painter, c. 320 BCE, provides one of the most comprehensive visual programs, showing multiple regions of the underworld, including Tartarus with its famous inhabitants. These artistic representations serve not merely decorative purposes, but didactic ones, reminding viewers of the potential consequences of moral transgression. In stark contrast to the dark depths of Tartarus stood Elysium, or the Elysian Fields, a realm of light, joy, and reward for the blessed dead. In Homer's Odyssey, Elysium appears as an exceptional destination, reserved not for the morally virtuous, but for favored mortals related to the gods. Menelaus is told he will be transported there not because of his moral excellence, but because he is the son-in-law of Zeus through his marriage to Helen. Homer describes this paradise as a place where life is easiest for men. No snow is there, nor heavy storm, nor ever rain, but ever does ocean send up blasts of the clear blowing west wind, that they may give cooling to men. This initial conception reflected aristocratic values. Elysium was essentially an extension of the privileged existence enjoyed by the heroic nobility in life, with divine favor rather than moral virtue determining one's fate. However, as Greek society evolved through the archaic and classical periods, the criteria for achieving this blessed state broadened. By the 5th century BCE, we find evidence in sources like Pindar's Odes that initiation into mystery cults, particularly the Eleusinian mysteries, could secure a blessed afterlife for adherents, regardless of their social status. Pindar's Second Olympian Ode provides one of our most vivid early descriptions of this expanded Elysian realm. As for those from whom Persephone accepts atonement for ancient grief, in the 9th year she sends their souls up again to the light of the sun above, and from these come noble kings, men swift in strength and greatest in wisdom, and for the rest of time men call them sacred heroes. This passage reveals several important developments. The blessed afterlife is now explicitly connected to moral purification, atonement for ancient grief. It involves possible reincarnation into privileged positions, and it establishes a category of sacred heroes who achieve a form of immortality through posthumous recognition and cult worship. As mystery religions and philosophical schools elaborated their doctrines, conceptions of Elysium became increasingly sophisticated. In Orphic and Pythagorean traditions, it represented not merely a pleasant afterlife, but a place of true philosophical enlightenment, where souls liberated from the cycle of reincarnation through proper initiation and conduct could contemplate divine truths in the company of the gods themselves. Gold tablets found in graves of presumed initiates contain instructions for the soul to identify itself to the underworld guardians. I am a child of earth and starry heaven, but my race is of heaven alone. This declaration established the initiate's claim to divine heritage and right to a blessed existence. Virgil, drawing on Greek traditions, provides one of the most detailed literary descriptions of Elysium in Book the Sixth of the Aeneid. His account reflects the synthesis of various Greek conceptions that had developed by the Hellenistic period. They came to places of delight, to green parkland where the fortunate live, to glades of blessedness. Some exercise their limbs on grassy wrestling grounds, compete in sport, and grapple on the yellow sand. Some mark time with their feet and sing their songs. They live in groves of deep and lovely trees, on meadows wet with streams or soft with grass. Virgil's Elysium combines elements of Homeric paradise, perfect climate and landscape, aristocratic pleasure, athletic competitions, and philosophical bliss, poetry and contemplation. It represents the ideal existence imagined by classical civilization, a life of balanced physical, intellectual, and aesthetic pleasures in a perfect natural setting. Between these extremes of punishment and reward lay intermediate realms for those who were neither exceptionally virtuous nor exceptionally wicked. The most extensive of these was the Asphodel Meadows, described by Homer as the default destination for ordinary souls. This gray, misty plain was neither paradise nor punishment, but a neutral territory where the majority of the dead existed in a diminished state, retaining their identities and memories, but lacking the vitality and substance of true life. The name derives from the asphodel, a pale flower that grows in waste places, and was associated with death in Greek culture. This botanical connection reinforced the meadow's liminal status, neither completely barren nor truly fertile, sustaining a form of existence that was neither torment nor bliss. Homer presents the shades in the Asphodel Meadows as conscious but diminished, recognizing Odysseus and conversing with him, but lacking sensory vividness unless temporarily revitalized by drinking sacrificial blood. They retain their memories and personalities, but exist in a state that seems more like endless dreaming than either true life or complete extinction. This conception reflects the Greek fear not of punishment after death, but of irrelevance and fading, the dread that one's identity and achievements would gradually dissolve into the universal grayness of mortality. Later traditions sometimes elaborated the Asphodel Meadows as a place of purification, where souls might prepare for either reincarnation or, after sufficient cleansing, advancement to more blessed regions. In some accounts, the duration of a soul's stay in this intermediate realm was determined by the balance of good and evil in their mortal life, creating a crude system of proportional justice that bridged the extremes of eternal punishment and eternal reward. Another significant intermediate region was the Fields of Mourning, Lugentes Campi, mentioned primarily in Roman sources but drawing on Greek traditions. This area was specifically designated for those who had died from love, suicides, the heartbroken, and victims of passion. Virgil describes encountering Dido, the Carthaginian queen who killed herself after being abandoned by Aeneas, in this region. This specialized territory reflects the Greek and Roman recognition of erotic passion as a potentially destructive force with its own unique moral category. neither virtuous nor truly vicious, but powerful enough to override rational self-interest and normal ethical constraints. The Isles of the Blessed Makaron represented yet another variation on the geography of reward. Sometimes identified with Elysium, and sometimes described as an even more exclusive paradise beyond it, these islands were typically reserved for heroes, and others specially favored by the gods. Hesiod, in Works and Days, locates them at the ends of the earth, near the encircling Oceanus, describing them as places where heroes live with carefree heart, in the Isles of the Blessed, along the shore of deep swirling Oceanus, prosperous heroes for whom the grain-giving soil bears honey-sweet fruit that ripens 3 times a year. This remote location reinforced their status as exceptional destinations, requiring divine transportation rather than the normal journey through the gates of Hades. The proliferation of these various realms reveals the complexity of Greek moral thinking and its resistance to simplistic binary judgments. Rather than a straightforward division between punishment and reward, the Greek underworld offered nuanced gradations that acknowledged the moral ambiguity of human existence. Few people were purely virtuous or wholly wicked. Most lived in the gray areas between extremes. The geography of the afterlife reflected this reality, providing appropriate destinations for the full spectrum of human moral achievement. This differentiated afterlife also accommodated the diverse strands of Greek religious thought. Traditional worship of the Olympian gods existed alongside mystery cults, philosophical schools, and regional traditions, each with its own emphasis and criteria for posthumous evaluation. Rather than forcing a choice between competing systems, the expandable geography of the underworld allowed these various traditions to coexist, with new regions and distinctions emerging as Greek thinking about death and moral responsibility evolved. The Greek conception of differentiated afterlife realms ultimately had profound influence far beyond Hellenic culture. Through its adoption and adaptation in Roman literature, particularly Virgil's influential Aeneid, this cosmic geography helped shape medieval Christian conceptions of hell, purgatory, and paradise. Even as the specific deities and myths of Greece faded from religious significance, the moral landscape they had mapped continued to provide a framework for understanding the relationship between earthly conduct and eternal consequences. Among the various regions of the Greek underworld, none better captures the peculiar melancholy of the Greek attitude toward death than the Asphodel Meadows. Neither a place of punishment nor a realm of reward, this vast, misty plain represented the default destination for ordinary souls, those who were neither heroic enough for Elysium nor wicked enough for Tartarus. As the eternal home for the majority of humanity, the Asphodel Meadows embodies the Greek understanding of death as neither annihilation nor glorification, but a strange, diminished continuation of existence, a shadow of life rather than its negation or its perfection. The name itself derives from the asphodel, asphodelos, a member of the lily family that produces pale, spindly flowers on a tall stalk. This unremarkable plant grows readily in waste places and poor soil throughout the Mediterranean region. The ancient Greeks associated it with death and the underworld, partly because it often grew in the rocky, uncultivated ground, typical of cemeteries, which were located outside city walls and away from valuable agricultural land. The pale coloration of the flowers, whitish with faint purple streaks, evoked the bloodless complexion attributed to the shades of the dead, while the plant's ability to thrive in barren soil made it an apt symbol for the diminished yet persistent existence imagined for the majority of the departed. Our earliest literary reference to the Asphodel Meadows appears in Homer's Odyssey, during the Nekia episode, in which Odysseus journeys to the borders of the underworld to consult the shade of the prophet Tiresias. After completing his interview with Tiresias, Odysseus remains at the pit of sacrificial blood he has dug, encountering various figures from his past. The hero describes how the shade of Achilles went away with long strides across the meadow of asphodel after their conversation. Later, Odysseus sees the shade of Ajax going off alone across the meadow of asphodel after refusing to speak with him due to their past quarrel over Achilles' armor. These brief references establish several important characteristics of the realm. First, it appears to be extensive, a place where souls can withdraw to solitude when they wish. Second, it allows for movement and agency. The shades are not confined or tormented, but can come and go as they please within this domain. Third, it preserves personal identity and memory. Achilles and Ajax remain themselves, retaining their distinctive personalities and their memories of mortal life, including grievances and relationships. Homer provides a more detailed description of the condition of souls in this region during Odysseus's encounter with the shade of Achilles. When Odysseus attempts to console Achilles by reminding him of the honor and authority he now enjoys among the dead, Achilles famously replies, "Do not try to make light of death to me, illustrious Odysseus. I would rather be a paid servant in a poor man's house and be above ground than king of kings among the dead." This remarkable statement reveals the Greek understanding of existence in the asphodel meadows as fundamentally inferior to even the humblest mortal life. Despite retaining his identity and status, Achilles experiences his posthumous condition as an impoverishment, a diminution of the sensory vividness, passionate engagement, and meaningful action that characterized his heroic mortal existence. The meadow of asphodel may not be a place of punishment, but neither is it a desirable destination. Homer's portrayal suggests that the shades in the asphodel meadows exist in a state resembling eternal drowsiness or a waking dream. They can recognize the living as the shades recognize Odysseus, converse, and remember, but they lack full sensory experience and vitality. They can be temporarily revitalized by drinking the blood of Odysseus' sacrifice, which momentarily restores their ability to communicate more fully, but this effect is transient. This conception reflects what many scholars identify as the core Greek anxiety about death. Not the fear of punishment, but the dread of irrelevance and fading, the horror of becoming less than fully real. The later literary tradition elaborates on Homer's sparse description, gradually developing a more detailed geography and sociology for this liminal realm. In some accounts, the asphodel meadows are described as misty and dim, illuminated neither by the sun of the upper world nor by the fires of Tartarus, but by a diffuse, grayish light that casts no shadows. This perpetual twilight reinforces the realm's intermediate status, neither the bright day of life nor the absolute darkness of oblivion. The physical characteristics of the meadow itself are variously described as flat and featureless or gently undulating, covered with the pale asphodel flowers and occasionally other plants associated with death in Greek culture, such as white poplars, black cypresses, and narcissus flowers, named for the youth who wasted away gazing at his own reflection. Some accounts mention streams or pools of still water reflecting the unchanging sky, creating a landscape of subtle melancholy rather than dramatic horror or beauty. The social organization of the asphodel meadows in later traditions often mirrors that of the upper world, with shades gathering in groups based on their former associations. Family members, citizens of the same polis, members of the same profession or military unit. Virgil, in Book 6 of the Aeneid, which draws heavily on Greek underworld traditions, describes encountering the shades of Trojan warriors gathered together, maintaining their collective identity even in death. This social continuity provided some consolation within the overall diminishment of the afterlife condition. One might be less substantial than in life, but at least one would not be alone. Unlike the inhabitants of Tartarus or Elysium, whose fates were fixed by their extreme virtue or wickedness, some traditions suggested that souls in the Asphodel Meadows might eventually experience change. In eschatologies influenced by mystery religions and philosophical schools, the meadow could serve as a place of purification, where souls gradually cleansed themselves of remaining earthly attachments before either proceeding to more blessed regions or returning to the upper world through reincarnation. This conception appears in Plato's myths of the afterlife, particularly in the Phaedo and the myth of air in the Republic, where souls undergo periods of reward or punishment proportional to their merits before choosing new lives. The Asphodel Meadows thus came to represent a form of intermediate state, not eternal damnation or salvation, but a transitional condition in which the consequences of one's mortal life worked themselves out over cosmic time. This conception had significant parallels with and influence on later religious developments, including the eventual emergence of the concept of purgatory in Christianity. Archaeological evidence provides tantalizing glimpses of how belief in this afterlife realm may have influenced Greek funerary practices. The inclusion of specific grave goods, particularly items associated with daily life rather than luxury objects, suggests preparation for continued existence in a form similar to mortal life. Common grave offerings included oil flasks, lekithoi, vessels for food and drink, combs, mirrors, and other toiletry items, as if the deceased would continue basic human activities in their new state. Unlike Egyptian tombs, which often contained elaborate provisions for a rich afterlife, Greek burials typically included modest, practical items, consistent with the conception of the Asphodel Meadows as a place of diminished but recognizable human existence. Artistic representations of the Asphodel Meadows are relatively rare compared to depictions of more dramatic underworld regions like Tartarus. When they do appear, particularly on white-ground lekithoi and Apulian red figure vases from the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, they often show calm, dignified scenes of shades conversing or wandering through stylized floral landscapes. These images lack the intensity of either torment or ecstasy, instead conveying a quiet, almost contemplative atmosphere appropriate to the meadow's intermediate status. The philosophical implications of the Asphodel Meadows concept are significant for understanding Greek attitudes toward morality and meaning. Unlike religious systems that emphasize extreme posthumous reward or punishment as primary motivations for ethical behavior, the Greek conception suggested that most people, neither heroic nor villainous, could expect a posthumous existence that was neither terrible nor wonderful, but simply less than life. This perspective placed the emphasis on finding meaning and excellence within mortal existence itself, rather than deferring fulfillment to an afterlife. For the Greeks, the truly terrible fate was not to suffer in Tartarus, but to be forgotten in the undifferentiated mass of shades wandering the Asphodel Meadows. This fear of posthumous irrelevance fueled the Greek concern with kleos, glory or fame, the kind of memorable achievement that would keep one's name and deeds alive in the minds of the living, even as one's shade faded in the misty meadows of the underworld. Achilles' choice in the Iliad between a long, unremarkable life and a brief one crowned with imperishable glory reflects this fundamental anxiety. Better to burn brightly in life and be remembered than to face the fading twilight of the Asphodel Meadows as an anonymous shade. The asphodel meadows thus represent a uniquely Greek compromise between the human desire for immortality and the recognition of mortality's inevitability. Unlike belief systems that promise eternal bliss for the faithful, or systems that posit complete extinction at death, the meadow offers a middle path: continuation without completion, existence without excellence, memory without meaning. It is neither the worst fate imaginable nor the best hope possible, simply the expected destination for most of humanity, a posthumous reflection of the ordinary lives most people live. In this mediocrity lies perhaps the meadow's greatest philosophical significance. By assigning the majority of souls to this intermediate realm, Greek thought acknowledged a fundamental truth often overlooked in more polarized afterlife systems. Most human lives occupy the vast middle ground between sainthood and depravity. The asphodel meadows give cosmic recognition to the ordinary, to lives that are neither heroic nor villainous, but simply human, with all the complexity and ambiguity that entails. This acknowledgement of moral ambiguity and ordinariness represents one of the most sophisticated and honest aspects of Greek afterlife beliefs. Rather than forcing every soul into categories of salvation or damnation, reward or punishment, the Greek underworld accommodated the full spectrum of human moral achievement, with the asphodel meadows standing as eternal testimony to the nuanced reality of most human lives. Neither wholly good nor wholly evil, neither completely meaningful nor entirely without significance, but somewhere in the vast, misty middle ground where most of us ultimately dwell. Among the diverse regions of the Greek underworld, none captured the imagination quite like Elysium, and its sometimes synonym, sometimes distinct counterpart, the Isles of the Blessed, Makaron Nesoi. These paradisiacal realms represented the highest aspiration for posthumous existence in Greek thought, places of perfect happiness reserved for those deemed worthy of exceptional reward. Yet, unlike the Christian heaven that would later dominate Western conceptions of paradise, the criteria for admission to these blessed domains evolved dramatically over time, reflecting changing Greek values and religious innovations. Our earliest literary reference to Elysium appears in Homer's Odyssey, where the sea god Proteus prophesies the fate of Menelaus, king of Sparta and husband of Helen. Proteus tells Menelaus that he will not die in Argos, but instead, the deathless gods will convey you to the Elysian plain and the ends of the earth, where fair-haired Rhadamanthus is. There life is easiest for men. No snow is there, nor heavy storm, nor ever rain, but ever does ocean send up blasts of the clear-blowing west wind, that they may give cooling to men. This initial conception of Elysium is striking for several reasons. First, it is located at the ends of the earth, rather than underground in the traditional realm of Hades, suggesting it may have originally been conceived as a separate destination entirely, perhaps reflecting earlier Indo-European traditions of celestial paradise. Second, its primary characteristics are climatic perfection and ease of life, indicating a fundamentally physical rather than spiritual form of bliss. Third, and perhaps most significant, Menelaus qualifies for this exceptional fate not through moral virtue, but through his status as Zeus's son-in-law, through his marriage to Helen, herself Zeus's daughter by Leda. This privileged destination was thus originally conceived as a function of divine connection rather than ethical merit. Hesiod, writing in approximately the same period as Homer, 8th-7th century BCE, presents a similar conception in his works and days, though he refers to the Isles of the Blessed rather than Elysium. And they live untouched by sorrow in the islands of the blessed along the shore of deep swirling ocean. Happy heroes for whom the grain-giving earth bears honey-sweet fruit, flourishing thrice a year, far from the deathless gods, and Cronus rules over them. Hesiod's account specifies that this paradise is reserved for heroes of the Fourth Age, the great warriors who fought at Thebes and Troy. Again, the qualification is aristocratic martial status rather than moral conduct, reflecting the values of early Greek society with its emphasis on heroic excellence, rather than ethical goodness. The notable differences between these early accounts, Elysium as a plain at world's end versus blessed islands in the ocean, ruled by Rhadamanthys versus Cronus, suggest that multiple paradisical traditions existed in early Greek culture, perhaps deriving from different regional or cultural sources. These various blessed realms would eventually be synthesized in later tradition, sometimes as synonyms and sometimes as distinct but related destinations. A significant evolution in the conception of Elysium and the Isles of the Blessed occurs in the poetry of Pindar during the early 5th century BCE. In his second Olympian ode, Pindar presents a more ethically oriented vision of posthumous reward. As for those from whom Persephone accepts atonement for ancient grief, in the 9th year she sends their souls up again to the light of the sun above, and from these come noble kings, men swift in strength and greatest in wisdom, and for the rest of time men call them sacred heroes. This passage reveals several important developments. First, worthiness for blessed afterlife now depends on atonement, rather than aristocratic status, suggesting ethical qualification. Second, Persephone, queen of the underworld, rather than Zeus or other Olympians, determines this worthiness. Third, the blessed state includes the possibility of reincarnation as exceptional individuals, creating a cycle of posthumous reward and renewed earthly excellence. Pindar elaborates on the nature of blessed existence in his dirges, fragmentary poems for funeral occasions. For them shines below the strength of the sun, while in our world it is night, and the space of crimson-flowered meadows before their city is full of the shade of frankincense trees and golden fruits. Some delight themselves with horses and physical exercise, others with board games, others with lyres. Among them all prosperity flourishes. A lovely fragrance spreads throughout the blessed land, as they continually mix all kinds of incense into far-shining fire on the gods' altars. This vivid description establishes several enduring features of the Elysian landscape. Perpetual daylight, contrasting with the gloom of the asphodel meadows, abundant vegetation, with special emphasis on flowers and fruit-bearing trees, pleasant fragrances, and the opportunity for favorite pastimes including athletic, intellectual, and artistic pursuits. The physical pleasure of Elysium is not sensually indulgent, but balanced and refined, reflecting the Greek ideal of moderation even in paradise. The significant shift in Pindar's conception reflects the growing influence of mystery religions in Greek culture, particularly the Eleusinian mysteries, dedicated to Demeter and Persephone. These initiatory cults promised their adherents special posthumous privileges, democratizing access to blessed afterlife by making it dependent on ritual initiation rather than heroic status or divine lineage. The famous Homeric hymn to Demeter, dated to approximately the 7th century BCE, contains the earliest reference to this promise. Blessed is he among men on earth who has seen these mysteries, but he who is uninitiated and who has no part in them never has lot of like good things once he is dead, down in the darkness and gloom. This democratization of paradise represented a revolutionary development in Greek religious thought. Now ordinary individuals, craftspeople, merchants, farmers, could aspire to the blessed afterlife previously reserved for aristocratic heroes, provided they underwent the proper initiatory rituals and maintained ritual purity. This shift reflected broader social changes in Greek society during the Archaic period, including the rise of the middle class, the development of democratic political systems, and increasing social mobility. The Orphic religious movement, emerging in the 6th century BCE, further developed this ethical conception of posthumous reward. Orphic doctrine held that humans possessed a divine element, sometimes identified with the soul or psyche, trapped within a physical body as punishment for primordial guilt. Through proper ritual observance, ethical living, and a series of reincarnations, this divine spark could eventually be purified and achieve blessed immortality. Gold tablets found in graves from the 4th century BCE onward, believed to be Orphic in origin, contained instructions for the deceased to navigate the underworld and claim their divine heritage. I am a child of earth and starry heaven, but my race is of heaven alone. This you know yourselves. And lo, I am parched with thirst and I perish. Give me quickly the cold water flowing forth from the lake of memory. These tablets instructed initiates to avoid the waters of forgetfulness, Lethe, and instead drink from the lake of memory, Mnemosyne, thereby retaining consciousness of their divine nature and breaking the cycle of reincarnation. The ultimate destination for such purified souls was a blessed existence variously identified with Elysium, the Isles of the Blessed, or simply the realm of the pure. Philosophical traditions, particularly those influenced by Pythagoreanism and Platonism, developed these concepts further. In Plato's Phaedo, Socrates describes how souls that have practiced philosophy and purified themselves depart to the invisible realm, to live in truth with the gods, having escaped from human ills. Those who have lived with exceptional piety without philosophical understanding are carried to a pure dwelling place above, where they live without bodies for all future time. The Phaedo specifically identifies pure souls as those who have practiced the philosophical virtues, moderation, justice, courage, and wisdom, creating a direct connection between ethical development and posthumous reward. In the Republic's concluding myth of Ir, Plato presents his most detailed vision of posthumous rewards and punishments. After judgment, virtuous souls ascend to the heavens while the wicked descend below the earth, each experiencing conditions proportional to their merits or demerits. After 1,000 years, souls gather to choose new lives, with the wisdom acquired through philosophical understanding guiding the most virtuous to make choices that will lead to further spiritual advancement. The ultimate goal in this Platonic conception is to break the cycle of reincarnation through perfect wisdom, a goal that parallels the Orphic aspiration but substitutes philosophical understanding for ritual purification as the primary means. By the Hellenistic period, 323 to 31 BCE, these various traditions, Homeric, Eleusinian, Orphic, and Platonic, had merged and cross-fertilized to create complex and sometimes contradictory conceptions of Elysium and the Isles of the Blessed. In some accounts, the two were identical. In others, the Isles represented an even more exclusive paradise beyond Elysium. Some traditions located these blessed realms in the far west beyond the ocean. Others placed them in the heavens. Still others situated them in a separate region of the underworld, distinct from Tartarus and the Asphodel Meadows. Virgil's Aeneid, though a Roman work, synthesizes Greek traditions to present one of the most vivid and influential literary depictions of Elysium. In Book 6, Aeneas visits the underworld guided by the Sibyl of Cumae, eventually reaching Elysium where he encounters his father, Anchises. Virgil describes the blessed realm. They came to places of delight, to green park land, where the fortunate live, to glades of blessedness. Here ampler ether clothes the meadows in roseate light, and they know their own sun and stars of their own. Some exercise their limbs on grassy wrestling grounds, compete in sport, and grapple on the yellow sand. Some mark time with their feet and sing their songs. They live in groves of deep and lovely trees, on meadows wet with streams or soft with grass. Virgil's Elysium combines elements from various Greek traditions: the perfect climate of Homer, the flowered meadows of Pindar, and the philosophical community of Plato. His inhabitants include poet-prophets, those who suffered wounds fighting for their country, those who lived as pure priests, and those who by inventions made life better, and those who by merit caused others to remember them. This diverse population reflects the Roman synthesis of Greek values: martial virtue, religious piety, cultural achievement, and civic contribution all qualify one for blessed afterlife. Archaeological evidence provides tantalizing glimpses of how these evolving conceptions of Elysium influenced material culture and funerary practices. Tomb paintings from Greek colonies in southern Italy show banquet scenes that likely represent the blessed afterlife, with the deceased reclining at eternal symposia. Funerary art increasingly incorporated Dionysiac imagery, dancing, music, ivy, and grape motifs, reflecting the gods' associations with ecstatic experience and rebirth. Grave goods sometimes included specialized items associated with mystery cult initiation, such as mirrors, symbols of self-knowledge in Orphic tradition, and cistae mysticae, sacred containers used in Dionysiac and Eleusinian rituals. The geographical reality behind these mythic conceptions remains debated. Many scholars connect the western location of Elysium and the Isles of the Blessed with Greek awareness of the Atlantic Ocean and possibly the Canary Islands, whose favorable climate and distance from the known world made them apt physical analogues for mythic paradise. Others link the concept to Egyptian influence, particularly the Field of Reeds, Eru, where the justified dead were believed to dwell in Egyptian religion. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus explicitly connects the Blessed Isles with the Atlantic, suggesting the myths reflect actual geographical knowledge filtered through religious imagination. What remains most significant about the Greek conception of Elysium and the Isles of the Blessed is their evolution from aristocratic preserve to ethical reward. This transformation reflects the broader development of Greek ethical thinking, from the status-based morality of Homeric society to the virtue ethics of classical philosophy, from tribal exclusivity to more universalist conceptions of human worth. The democratization of paradise through mystery religion initiated a revolutionary shift in Western religious thought, establishing the principle that posthumous reward should correspond to moral desert rather than social privilege or divine favoritism. At the same time, the physical nature of Greek paradise reveals fundamental differences from later monotheistic conceptions. The pleasures of Elysium remained recognizably human: athletic competition, musical performance, philosophical conversation, the enjoyment of beautiful surroundings, rather than the direct contemplation of divinity emphasized in Christian, Jewish, and Islamic paradises. Even in its most spiritualized forms, Greek blessed afterlife maintained continuity with the best aspects of embodied human experience, rather than transcending humanity entirely. This balance between transcendence and continuity, between ethical reward and physical pleasure, between exclusive privilege and democratic access, made the Greek paradise tradition uniquely influential in Western culture. Through its absorption into Roman literature and its parallel development alongside emerging Christianity, the imagery and values of Elysium helped shape conceptions of the afterlife that would influence Western civilization for millennia to come. Deep below the already subterranean realm of Hades proper, beyond the gloomy asphodel meadows and separate from the blessed fields of Elysium, Greek cosmology placed Tartarus, a region of darkness, suffering, and punishment so profound that it represented the absolute nadir of existence. Hesiod claimed it was as far beneath the earth as heaven was above it, a distance so vast that an anvil falling from the earth would take 9 days and nights to reach Tartarus. This remote, terrible place served multiple functions in Greek religious thought: cosmic prison, instrument of divine justice, cautionary example, and ultimate expression of the consequences of transgression against natural and moral order. In the earliest Greek cosmogony, Hesiod's Theogony, composed around 700 BCE, Tartarus appears as one of the primordial entities that existed at the beginning of creation alongside Chaos, Gaia, Earth, and Eros. This primeval Tartarus was not yet specifically a place of punishment, but rather a murky, foundational region of the cosmos, the lowest depth contrasting with the heights of heaven. As Hesiod's cosmological narrative progresses, Tartarus increasingly takes on the role of divine prison, the place where Zeus confines defeated enemies of the Olympian order, the Titans after their defeat in the Titanomachy, and later the monster Typhon after his failed assault on Olympus. The physical description of Tartarus in these early accounts emphasizes its nature as the ultimate confinement. Hesiod describes it as surrounded by a bronze fence with gates crafted by Poseidon, while Homer in the Iliad calls it a pit profound that yawns beneath the earth. Both stress its remoteness from the domains of gods and humans, making it the perfect place to isolate threats to cosmic order. This conception reflects a fundamental concern of early Greek religious thought: the maintenance of proper boundaries between different orders of being. Gods, humans, monsters, and titans each had their appropriate sphere, and transgression of these boundaries constituted the most fundamental form of impiety. As Greek moral thinking developed through the Archaic period, 800 to 480 BCE, this cosmological prison gradually transformed into a place of punishment for human transgressors as well as divine ones. By the Classical period, 480 to 323 BCE, Tartarus had become specifically associated with exemplary sinners whose offenses were deemed worthy of eternal punishment. The paradigmatic inhabitants were mythological figures whose stories served as moral cautionary tales, including Sisyphus, king of Corinth, condemned to endlessly roll a boulder up a steep hill, only to have it roll back down again just before reaching the summit. His punishment resulted from multiple transgressions against divine order, including cheating death, Thanatos, by tricking him into his own shackles and revealing divine secrets, specifically telling the river god Asopus that Zeus had abducted his daughter Aegina. Tantalus, a son of Zeus who was initially honored with a place at the god's table, but abused this privilege in multiple ways, stealing ambrosia and nectar to share with mortals, revealing divine secrets, and, most horrifically, serving his own son Pelops as a meal to test whether the gods would know they were consuming human flesh. His punishment was to stand forever in a pool of water beneath fruit-laden branches, with both food and drink receding whenever he reached for them, suffering eternal hunger and thirst. Ixion, king of the Lapiths, who violated guest-host relations by attempting to seduce Hera after Zeus had purified him of the crime of kinslaying. As punishment, he was bound to a fiery wheel that turned continuously through the air of Tartarus. Tydeus, a giant who attempted to rape Leto, mother of Apollo and Artemis, and was slain by her divine children. In Tartarus, he was staked to the ground while vultures eternally devoured his liver, which regenerated each night. The Danaids, 49 daughters of Danaus who murdered their husbands on their wedding night, with one daughter sparing her husband. Their punishment was to endlessly carry water in sieves or in jars with holes, unable to ever fill their vessels. What united these famous transgressors was not merely the severity of their punishments, but the nature of their crimes. Each had committed what the Greeks considered hybris, extreme arrogance or presumption that led them to violate fundamental boundaries, particularly those between mortals and gods. Sisyphus had cheated death itself. Tantalus had betrayed divine hospitality through cannibalism. Ixion had attempted to seduce the queen of the gods. Tydeus had attacked the mother of divine twins. These were not merely crimes against other individuals, but assaults on the cosmic order itself, warranting exceptional and eternal punishment. The specificity of these punishments revealed another important aspect of Tartarus, the principle of poetic justice, or punishment fitting the crime, lex talionis. Each torment ingeniously reflected the nature of the original transgression. Tantalus, who had abused sacred guest-host relationships through cannibalism, suffered eternal hunger and thirst, a perpetual denial of proper hospitality. Sisyphus, who had used his cleverness to cheat death, was condemned to endless, futile labor that mocked his vaunted intelligence. The Danaids, who had violated the sanctity of marriage, were assigned a domestic task, carrying water, rendered meaningless by their inability to complete it. This principle would later be elaborated in philosophical and mystery traditions to encompass ordinary human sinners as well as mythic exemplars. Plato provides our most detailed philosophical exploration of this expanded conception of Tartarus in dialogues like the Gorgias and Phaedo. In the Gorgias, Socrates presents a myth of judgment in which souls are evaluated purely on their moral character, without regard to their earthly status. Those found to have lived unjustly are sent to Tartarus, but with an important distinction. Those whose transgressions are curable undergo punishment that causes them to benefit before eventually being released, while those deemed incurable suffer eternal torment not for their own benefit, since they are beyond redemption, but as examples to others who might see them and be deterred from similar wickedness. This conception of Tartarus reflects the evolution of Greek penological thinking, which increasingly distinguished between retributive punishment, timoria, and corrective kolasis. The torments of Tartarus could serve either purpose: rehabilitation for ordinary sinners, or eternal retribution for the most extreme transgressors. This distinction appears even more clearly in Plato's Phaedo, where he describes various categories of wrongdoers receiving appropriate treatments in the afterlife, with only the most heinous offenders, those guilty of numerous and enormous sacrileges or many unjust and illegal murders, suffering permanent confinement in Tartarus. Plato's vision was influential in developing a more systematic moral geography of the underworld. In the Republic's concluding myth of Air, he describes how judges direct souls to either an upward path to the heavens for the virtuous or a downward path beneath the earth for the wicked. The punishments suffered below are proportional to the crimes committed, with each injustice receiving a tenfold retribution. Those who have committed the worst atrocities, tyrants, murderers, and others guilty of terrible injustices, are denied exit from the underground journey, with some particularly incurable souls being dismembered, carded like wool on thorns, and cast into Tartarus, never to emerge. Virgil, drawing on Greek traditions, provides one of the most vivid literary depictions of Tartarus in Book 6 of the Aeneid. As Aeneas and the Sibyl approach the fortress-like structure of Tartarus, they hear groaning from within, and the sound of savage floggings, then the grating of iron and dragging chains. The Sibyl explains that inside sits Rhadamanthus, who chastises and hears the history of wrongdoing and forces confessions. Virgil catalogues the inhabitants, including the Titans, giants who stormed Olympus, those who hated their brothers, defrauded dependents, committed adultery, pursued civil war, or broke faith with masters. A comprehensive list that combines mythological transgressors, with ordinary human wrongdoers of various types. Artistic representations of Tartarus became increasingly elaborate in Greek art of the classical and Hellenistic periods. Vase paintings depict the famous mythic sinners in their torments, often supervised by chthonic deities or personifications of justice. The Apulian volute crater by the underworld painter, c. 320 BCE, provides one of the most comprehensive visual programs, showing multiple regions of the underworld, including Tartarus with its famous inhabitants. These artistic representations served not merely decorative purposes but didactic ones, reminding viewers of the potential consequences of moral transgression. The physical environment of Tartarus was imagined in increasingly specific terms over time. Early accounts emphasized darkness, remoteness, and confinement. Later descriptions added features like the river Phlegethon or Pyrophlegethon, a stream of fire that surrounded or flowed through the region. Some traditions spoke of intense cold rather than heat, creating a place of freezing rather than burning, a conception that would later influence medieval visions of hell. Various monsters and personifications were said to inhabit the region as wardens or tormentors, including the Erinyes, Furies, who pursued oathbreakers and kinslayers, and figures like Campe, a Dracaena, female dragon, who had served as jailer of the Cyclopes and Hundred-Handers before Zeus freed them during the Titanomachy. The development of Tartarus as a place of punishment reflected broader changes in Greek thinking about justice, moral responsibility, and divine order. Early Greek religion had focused primarily on maintaining proper relations with the gods through sacrifice and ritual observance, with less emphasis on moral behavior, as moderns would understand it. As Greek ethical thought developed, particularly through the philosophical schools and mystery religions of the classical period, increased emphasis fell on personal virtue and justice in human relationships as essential components of piety. This shift required a more developed conception of divine justice that would address wrongdoing not adequately punished during mortal life. The elaboration of Tartarus addressed this need by creating a cosmic mechanism for ensuring that ultimately no transgression went unpunished and no injustice remained unaddressed. For a society increasingly concerned with questions of justice, as evidenced by the development of sophisticated legal systems in various Greek polis, the assurance that cosmic justice would eventually prevail provided powerful consolation in the face of apparent earthly injustice. When the wicked seemed to prosper and the virtuous suffer, the existence of Tartarus suggested that such apparent imbalances would eventually be corrected in the final accounting of souls. At the same time, the rehabilitative aspect of Tartarus revealed in Plato and other philosophical sources reflected a more sophisticated understanding of punishment's purpose. Rather than mere retribution, suffering could serve to purify and educate the soul, preparing it for eventual release and advancement. This conception paralleled developments in Greek legal thinking, which increasingly distinguished between different types of homicide and assigned varying penalties based on intent and circumstance, rather than applying a simple retributive formula. The Greek conception of Tartarus as a place of both eternal punishment for the incurably wicked and temporary correction for lesser offenders would have profound influence on later religious traditions. Through its adoption and adaptation in Roman literature, particularly Virgil's influential Aeneid, this cosmic penitentiary helped shape medieval Christian conceptions of hell and eventually purgatory. The principle of punishment fitting the crime, the distinction between corrective and retributive suffering, and the emphasis on proportionality between transgression and penalty all found their way into Christian theology of the afterlife. often with explicit reference to classical precedents. What distinguishes Greek conceptions of Tartarus from some later visions of hell, however, is the relative absence of theological offense as grounds for punishment. The inhabitants of Tartarus were not condemned for failing to worship particular gods or perform specific rituals. Impiety in Greek religion typically meant transgressive action rather than incorrect belief. Instead, they suffered for violations of fundamental moral and cosmic boundaries. Treachery against kin and guests, violence against parents, rebellion against legitimate authority, attempts to cheat natural processes like death, and extreme arrogance that led to overstepping mortal limitations. These were offenses against the natural order rather than against divine ego, reflecting the Greek understanding of cosmos as an integrated system in which gods, humans, and natural forces each had their proper place and function. Tartarus thus represented not merely divine vengeance, but cosmic restoration, the necessary counterbalance to actions that threatened to destabilize the order of existence itself. Its terrors were terrible precisely because the transgressions it punished were themselves terrible in their implications, not merely for their specific victims, but for the entire framework of Greek understanding of reality. In the Greek worldview, cosmos, order, always struggled against chaos, and Tartarus stood as the ultimate guarantee that chaos, though it might temporarily gain advantage, would never ultimately prevail. At the murky boundary between life and death, where the waters of the river Styx, or sometimes the Acheron, create an impassable barrier for mortal souls, stands one of the most enduring figures of Greek underworld mythology. Charon, the grim ferryman who transports the dead to their eternal dwelling place. Neither god nor mortal, neither malevolent nor benevolent, this liminal figure embodies the inevitable transition that awaits all humans, the final journey from the realm of the living to the domain of the dead. The earliest literary mention of Charon appears not in Homer, whose underworld in the Odyssey lacks this specific figure, but in fragments of the epic poem Minyas, attributed to Prodicus of Phocaea, 7th-6th century BCE, and in the works of the lyric poet Archilochus, c. 680 to 645 BCE. By the 5th century BCE, Charon had become a standard feature of underworld geography, appearing in Aristophanes' comedy The Frogs, where the god Dionysus must pay him to cross the Styx during his journey to retrieve the playwright Euripides from Hades. The most detailed ancient description of Charon comes from Virgil's Aeneid, which draws heavily on earlier Greek traditions. Virgil portrays him as a terrible ferryman, unkempt and aged but still vigorous, with unkempt white hair that lies on his chin in profusion, and eyes that stare in a fixed flame. He wears a dirty, knotted cloak hanging from his shoulder, and pulls his dusky craft across the waters with all the authority of a god. Though Virgil writes in Latin for a Roman audience, his portrayal crystallizes Greek conceptions that had developed over centuries. In Greek art, Charon appears frequently on white-ground lekythoi, oil flasks used in funeral rituals, from the 5th century BCE. These depictions show him as an aged but sturdy man, typically bearded, wearing the eximus, a short tunic fastened over one shoulder, common attire for workmen, and sometimes a conical cap, similar to that worn by the god Hephaestus. He stands in his skiff, using a pole to navigate, while shades of the dead approach or board his vessel. These visual representations emphasize his role as a worker, a supernatural service provider, rather than a divine power or monster. The etymology of Charon's name offers insight into how the Greeks conceptualized this figure. Most likely derived from the Greek word charopos, meaning bright-eyed or fierce-eyed. The name may be euphemistic, a way of referring indirectly to death's intensity, by focusing on the keen gaze of its agent. This practice of using favorable or neutral terms for frightening concepts, euphemism, was common in Greek religious language, particularly regarding chthonic powers. Alternatively, some scholars connect his name to Charon, one who shows favor or kindness, another possible euphemism for death as release from suffering. As ferryman of the dead, Charon's primary function was transportational rather than judgmental. He did not determine who could cross, but simply conveyed those who met certain prerequisites. The most famous of these was payment. The dead were required to provide an obolos, a small coin, for passage. This belief manifested in the widespread Greek funerary practice of placing a coin in the mouth of the deceased during burial preparations, a custom archaeologically attested across the Greek world from the Archaic period onward. The 2nd century CE author, Lucian, explains, "In the first place, as soon as someone has died, they put an obol in his mouth to pay the ferryman for the crossing." The necessity of payment created a potential crisis for those buried without this ritual provision. According to some traditions, souls lacking the fare would be forced to wander the near shore for 100 years before Charon would transport them without payment. This belief underscored the importance of proper funeral rites. Without them, the deceased would suffer prolonged liminal status, neither properly among the living nor fully integrated into the realm of the dead. A second prerequisite for Charon's ferry service was proper burial. The unburied, those who died without funeral rites, whether through neglect, punishment, or misfortune such as drowning at sea, could not cross immediately. Like those without payment, they were condemned to wander the near shore for a century. This belief reinforced the social obligation to ensure proper disposal of the dead, even enemies or strangers. The famous episode in Sophocles' Antigone, where the heroine defies royal decree to bury her brother Polynices, reflects the profound religious importance attached to funeral rites. Without burial, the soul remained trapped in a distressing intermediate state. Despite his fearsome appearance and association with death, Charon was not conceived as evil or malevolent. Unlike figures such as Thanatos, death personified, or the Keres, spirits of violent death, who actively brought death to the living, Charon merely facilitated the inevitable transition after death had already occurred. His role was necessary and ultimately beneficial within the cosmic order, ensuring that souls reached their proper destination rather than remaining stranded in the liminal space between worlds. This essentially neutral characterization of Charon reflects broader Greek attitudes toward death, not as a moral punishment or evil force, but as a natural process that maintained cosmic balance. While Greeks certainly feared death and mourned their deceased, their religious framework presented the afterlife journey as an ordered transition rather than a terrifying seizure. Charon's role as ferryman, providing transportation for a fee, like any service provider in the living world, domesticated and regularized this transition, making it comprehensible through familiar economic and social frameworks. Nevertheless, Charon accumulated more fearsome characteristics in some traditions, particularly as Greek culture evolved and interacted with other Mediterranean religions. In some accounts, he actively gathered souls rather than merely receiving them, wielding his pole as a tool to draw in the dead or to push away the living who approached his realm prematurely. Certain vase paintings show him with more monstrous features, sometimes with winged shoulders or a more bestial countenance, suggesting that popular imagination occasionally departed from the more workmanlike literary portrayal. The Greek colonies of southern Italy and Sicily, Magna Graecia, developed particularly elaborate conceptions of Charon. Apulian red figure vases from the 4th century BCE often show him with hammer and nails, apparently associated with sealing the doors of death. This regional variation may reflect influence from indigenous Italian cultures, particularly the Etruscans, whose death deity Charon, likely related linguistically to the Greek Charon, appeared as a more monstrous figure with a hammer, sometimes with blue skin and animal features. These Italian Greeks also sometimes portrayed Charon with a more active role in enforcing the boundary between life and death, suggesting a conception of the ferryman as not merely transporter, but borderline guardian. Despite these variations, Charon's essential function remained consistent across Greek culture. He was the necessary intermediary who facilitated the soul's final journey. His presence in underworld mythology addressed a fundamental question of Greek thanatology, study of death. How does the soul navigate the transition from the familiar world of the living to the unknown realm of the dead? The answer, via a ferry service operated by a supernatural but comprehensible figure, provided reassuring structure to this mysterious passage. Charon's endurance in Greek imagination is evidenced by his continued presence in folklore even after the decline of classical religion. In modern Greek folk tradition, Charontas, the modern Greek form of his name, evolved into a more active death figure, sometimes identified with Thanatos, or even functioning as psychopomp, soul guide. The phrase Charon's obol remains proverbial in many languages, referring to a final payment or obligation, demonstrating the lasting cultural impact of this underworld ferryman. The philosophical implications of Charon's role are significant. As an intermediary figure who was neither divine nor mortal, neither alive nor dead, he embodied the liminal nature of death itself, the threshold state between existence and non-existence. His requirement of payment introduced economic transaction into the afterlife journey, suggesting that even in death, social systems and exchanges continued. The necessity of proper burial for passage reinforced the interdependence of the living and the dead, with the deceased relying on the living for ritual completion of their journey. In essence, Charon stood as the personification of transition itself, the process of moving from one state of being to another. His boat bridged worlds that could not otherwise connect, creating passage across the impassable. Neither malevolent nor benevolent, but simply necessary, he represented the Greek understanding of death as neither punishment nor reward, but inevitable transformation. A journey that required proper preparation and assistance, but ultimately delivered each soul to its appropriate destination in the cosmic order. Guarding the gates of the underworld, preventing the living from entering unbidden, and the dead from escaping their eternal abode, stands one of Greek mythology's most fearsome and enduring creatures. Cerberus, the multi-headed hound of Hades. This monstrous canine sentinel embodied the absolute boundary between life and death, serving as both literal and symbolic guardian of the underworld's threshold. His ferocious vigilance ensured that the natural order remained intact, the living stayed among the living, the dead among the dead, maintaining the cosmic separation essential to Greek religious thought. Our earliest literary reference to this underworld guardian appears in Hesiod's Theogony, composed around 700 BCE, which describes him as the cruel hound of Hades, voracious Cerberus who eats raw flesh, the bronze-voiced hound of Hades, 50-headed, relentless, and strong. This initial description already establishes key characteristics: his association with Hades, his carnivorous appetite, his terrifying voice, and his supernatural strength. Notably, Hesiod attributes 50 heads to the creature, a number that would later be standardized as 3 in most classical sources. Homer's Iliad makes passing reference to the Hound of Hades, though without naming Cerberus directly when describing Heracles' past journey to the underworld. The Odyssey omits mention of the creature entirely during Odysseus's Nekia consultation with the dead, suggesting that in the earliest Greek epic tradition, this guardian figure was present but not yet fully developed as a standardized mythological character. By the 6th century BCE, visual representations consistently depict Cerberus with 3 heads, occasionally with a serpent for a tail and snakes emerging from his body. A Hydria water jar from approximately 530 BCE shows Heracles dragging a 3-headed Cerberus from the underworld, while a slightly later Attic black figure amphora depicts a similar scene with snakes sprouting from the hound's body. This iconographic standardization reflects the consolidation of the Cerberus myth in Greek religious imagination during the Archaic period. The name Cerberus itself remains etymologically contested. Some scholars connect it to the Indo-European root Kerberos, meaning spotted, suggesting an original conception as a spotted hound similar to those associated with death in Indo-European myth more broadly. Others propose a relationship to Kerberos, allegedly the Greek word for demon of the pit, though this etymology is disputed. Still others suggest possible pre-Greek or even Semitic origins for the name. This etymological uncertainty reflects Cerberus's likely ancient origins in prehistoric Indo-European mythology, subsequently developed and elaborated through centuries of Greek cultural evolution. The standard classical depiction of Cerberus credited him with 3 heads, though variations existed. Some accounts added a mane of live serpents, a dragon's tail, lion's claws, or 100 snake heads along his back. The 2nd century CE traveler Pausanias notes, "The poets have described him as a dog with 3 heads, though Homer speaks of him as the hound of Hades without specifying that he was 3-headed. I do not know how the story of the 3 heads first arose, unless it was because of a resemblance to the serpent of Tainarum, which was regarded as extremely venomous." This passage reveals both the standardization of the 3-headed image by the classical period and ancient awareness that this representation had evolved over time. The 3 heads served multiple symbolic functions. Most practically, they allowed Cerberus to maintain vigilance in all directions simultaneously, preventing any soul from slipping past unnoticed. Mythologically, the triplicity connected him to other chthonic, underworld powers associated with the number 3, including the triple goddess Hecate and the 3 judges of the dead, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus. Philosophically, the 3 heads came to represent the threefold nature of time consuming all things, past, present, and future, devouring every mortal life. Cerberus's genealogy placed him within a family of chthonic monsters. According to Hesiod, he was the offspring of Echidna, half-woman, half-serpent, and Typhon, a monstrous storm giant who challenged Zeus, making him brother to other composite beasts, including the Lernaean Hydra, the Chimera, and the Sphinx. This monstrous lineage emphasized his nature as a creature of primordial chaos, predating the orderly cosmos established by the Olympian gods, and representing the dangerous, untamed forces that persisted at the boundaries of that order. As guardian of the underworld gates, Cerberus performed dual functions, preventing the unauthorized entry of the living and blocking the escape of the dead. This bidirectional vigilance made him more complex than a simple monster. He was a necessary cosmic officer, maintaining the fundamental separation between life and death. The Roman poet Virgil, drawing on Greek traditions, describes how Cerberus, with his triple-throated baying, fills the kingdom and lies huge in a cave that fronts the crossing. His permanent station at the threshold made him the ultimate liminal monster, eternally positioned at the boundary between worlds. In most accounts, Cerberus showed appropriate deference to legitimate underworld authorities and legitimate visitors. He fawned on Hades and Persephone, recognizing their divine authority, and allowed entry to those properly dead, with burial rites completed. And those few living individuals granted special divine permission to visit the underworld and return. However, any unauthorized attempt to cross in either direction provoked his ferocious response, baring his 3 sets of teeth, raising the snakes along his back, and producing his terrifying triple bark that echoed through the caverns of Hades. The most famous myth involving Cerberus was his capture by Heracles as the final of the hero's 12 labors. Eurystheus, king of Tiryns, who assigned the labors, deliberately set this task believing it impossible to accomplish, effectively a death sentence for Heracles. The hero, however, prepared himself by being initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries, which provided sacred knowledge about the underworld. Different versions of the myth describe various methods by which Heracles subdued the beast. In some accounts, he used his extraordinary strength to physically overpower Cerberus. In others, he used the lion skin he wore from the Nemean lion, his first labor, as protection against the hound's venomous fangs. In still others, he charmed the beast with music or offered him drugged honeycakes. After capturing Cerberus, Heracles briefly brought him to the upper world to demonstrate his accomplishment to Eurystheus, then dutifully returned him to his underworld post. This temporary removal of the boundary guardian represented a momentary disruption of cosmic order, the ultimate heroic achievement, but one quickly and responsibly rectified. The myth thus reinforced rather than undermined the necessity of maintaining separation between the realms of life and death. This episode became one of the most frequently depicted scenes in Greek art, appearing on numerous vases, reliefs, and later Roman sarcophagi. The motif held particular significance in funerary contexts, where it symbolized the deceased's final journey into the underworld. By depicting Heracles' triumph over the guardian of death, these funerary images suggested hope for the deceased, not necessarily escape from death, but mastery over its terrors through proper ritual preparation and divine assistance. Beyond the Heracles myth, Cerberus appears in other significant underworld journeys. Orpheus, descending to retrieve his wife Eurydice, supposedly lulled Cerberus to sleep with his enchanting music, demonstrating art's power to temporarily suspend even death's strictures. Aeneas, in Virgil's Aeneid, placates Cerberus with a drugged honeycake suggested by the Sibyl of Cumae, showing that proper ritual knowledge could neutralize the hound's ferocity. In both cases, the underworld guardian is not defeated or removed, but temporarily pacified, allowing exceptional passage while maintaining the general boundary. Philosophical interpretations of Cerberus evolved alongside his mythological role. The Neoplatonist philosopher Porphyry, 234–305 CE, in his On Images, offers an allegorical reading. Cerberus is represented with 3 heads, because the positions of the sun above the earth are 3, rising, midday, and setting. This solar interpretation reflects later philosophical tendencies to find cosmic symbolism in traditional mythological figures. Earlier, the Stoic philosopher Cornutus, 1st century CE, suggested that Cerberus represented the earth that consumes all bodies, with his 3 heads symbolizing the 3 main divisions of the inhabited world: Europe, Asia, and Africa. In the mystery religions that became increasingly important in late classical antiquity, Cerberus acquired additional significance as a symbol of initiation. The Eleusinian and Orphic mysteries promised adherents knowledge that would help them navigate the underworld after death, including the ability to safely pass its guardians. Gold tablets found in graves of presumed Orphic initiates contain instructions and passwords for the underworld journey, implying that proper ritual knowledge could ensure safe passage past figures like Cerberus. The temporary subduing of the hound by heroes like Heracles and Orpheus came to represent the initiate's potential triumph over death's terrors through sacred knowledge. Despite his fearsome nature, Cerberus was not considered evil within Greek religious thought, but rather a necessary cosmic functionary, terrifying but appropriate to his role. Like Charon the ferryman, he represented the ordered processes of death, rather than death's malevolence. His presence ensured that the dead reached their proper destination and remained there, preventing cosmic disorder that would result from blurring the boundaries between life and death. The terror he inspired was proportional to the importance of the boundary he guarded. The endurance of Cerberus in Western imagination speaks to the power of this symbol. From Dante's Inferno, where he appears as a ravenous, dirt-devouring monster tormenting gluttons in the third circle of hell, to modern fantasy literature and games where multi-headed dogs frequently guard important thresholds, this image continues to evoke the terrifying yet necessary guardianship of life's most significant boundary. The three-headed hound of Hades remains one of Greek mythology's most recognizable contributions to world culture, embodying the ancient understanding of death as a realm separate from life, requiring guardianship, respect, and proper passage. A boundary that might be crossed under special circumstances, but never with impunity. Within the complex bureaucracy of the Greek underworld, perhaps no figures better exemplified the evolution of afterlife beliefs toward ethical considerations than the judges of the dead, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus. These three mythological kings, renowned for their justice during life, were believed to preside over a posthumous tribunal that assessed each soul's moral record and assigned appropriate afterlife destinations. Their emergence as central underworld administrators reflects the growing importance of ethical evaluation in Greek conceptions of death and divine justice. The concept of posthumous judgment does not appear in Homer's underworld. In the Odyssey's Nekia episode, souls seem to receive their underworld stations based primarily on their status in life, rather than their moral conduct. The exceptions, mythic figures suffering eternal punishment, like Tantalus and Sisyphus, are presented as special cases rather than examples of a universal judgment system. This early conception reflected aristocratic warrior society's emphasis on status and achievement, rather than ethical behavior as moderns would understand it. The first clear literary reference to underworld judges appears in Pindar's Second Olympian Ode, 476 BCE, where Rhadamanthus is described as sitting in judgment in the Isles of the Blessed. There the ocean breezes blow around the islands of the blessed, and flowers of gold are blazing, some from splendid trees on land, while water nurtures others. With these wreaths and garlands of flowers they entwine their hands according to the righteous counsels of Rhadamanthus, whom the great father, the husband of Rhea, whose throne is above all others, keeps ready at his side as his partner. This initial conception presents Rhadamanthus as an administrator of paradise, rather than a judge determining who enters. But it establishes the connection between these mythological figures and posthumous justice. Pindar's emphasis on righteous counsels reinforces Rhadamanthus's reputation for exceptional fairness, a quality that made him suitable for this cosmic role. By the classical period, a more developed tribunal system appears in sources like Plato's dialogues. In the Gorgias, Socrates describes a comprehensive system of underworld judgment instituted by Zeus. In the time of Cronus, there was a law concerning mankind, and it holds still among the gods, that when a man who has lived a just and pious life comes to his end, he should go to the Isles of the Blessed and dwell there in perfect happiness beyond the reach of evil. But when a man who has lived unjustly and impiously dies, he should go to the prison house of justice and punishment, which they call Tartarus. Socrates explains that under Cronus, judgments were rendered on the final day of a person's life while they were still living. But this system proved flawed because people dressed impressively and brought witnesses to testify to their good character, deceiving the judges. Zeus reformed the system by making judgment occur after death, with souls stripped naked of bodily appearance and social status, allowing their true moral character to be evaluated. To ensure perfect justice, Zeus appointed his 3 sons as judges, Minos and Rhadamanthus from Asia and Aeacus from Europe. These, after they are dead, shall give judgment in the meadow at the dividing of the road, whence the 2 ways lead, one to the Isles of the Blessed and the other to Tartarus. This account establishes several key aspects of the judge's role. First, they operate in a specific location, the meadow at the dividing of the road, serving as cosmic traffic directors who determine each soul's appropriate destination. Second, their judgment considers the soul's inherent moral quality rather than external factors like wealth, beauty, or social position. Third, they function as representatives of divine justice rather than arbitrary authorities, implementing Zeus's cosmic moral law. In Plato's Apology, Socrates expresses eager anticipation at the prospect of being judged by this underworld tribunal after his execution. What would a man not give if he might converse with Orpheus and Musaeus and Hesiod and Homer? Nay, if this be true, let me die again and again. Above all, I shall be able to continue my search into true and false knowledge. As in this world, so also in that. I shall find out who is wise and who pretends to be wise and is not. What would not a man give, O judges, to be able to examine the leader of the great Trojan expedition, or Odysseus or Sisyphus, or numberless others, men and women too? What infinite delight would there be in conversing with them and asking them questions? For in that world they do not put a man to death for this. Certainly not. For besides being happier in that world than in this, they will be immortal, if what is said is true.